I'm Adam Arenson, professor of history at Manhattan College and the author of Banking on Beauty, Millard Sheets, and Mid-Century Modern Architecture in California. Millard Sheets was initially known as a watercolorist. He had made his name in painting outside in California. And then as he had gained more training and more interest in other kinds of artwork, he came to be the head of the Scripps College art department. And there he worked with sculptors and with people who worked in stained glass and in mosaic and in enamel. And he got interested in larger projects. He often met people when he was traveling, and he got involved with projects that they suggested to him. During World War II, he had worked on Thunderbird air schools, which were built all across the West, including in Ontario and Phoenix, which are now the airports in those cities. And most of the work was simply finding a quick way to get pilots trained for flying in the Pacific. But Millard Sheets made sure that the artwork was on the walls and that the furniture was done nicely. And this interest in expanding into art and architecture beyond painting is one of the things that I think attracted Howard Ahmanson. Ahmanson, according to the stories, called him up one day in 1953 and said, "I have two properties. I need buildings. Come see them." And they went out to lunch, and they drove from downtown Los Angeles out to Beverly Hills. And they didn't talk about the artworks. They didn't talk about the buildings. They didn't talk about anything related to the supposed commission. And then on the way back, Ahmanson pointed out the window of the car and said, "Here's one property." And then a little while later, "Here's another property, one in Beverly Hills and one at Wilshire and Serrano." And when they got downtown, Ahmanson said, "So, do you want to do the project?" And Sheets said, "Well, what's the project? You haven't explained anything to me." He said, "Well, just build a building like you would do it yourself." And Sheets had told a story that he called up and asked about the budget and asked about like what he should use, and that Ahmanson hung up on him. And then he called back and said, "I think we were disconnected." And Ahmanson's secretary said, "No, that he hung up on you. He really wants you to do it as if you were doing it for yourself." So these first projects, which were finished in 1955 and 1956, included many of the elements that we see in later home savings projects, that they were generally two-story buildings, closed off from the outside, but they opened up into these double height spaces inside. They had sculptures, they had stained glass, they had mosaics. Sheets made sure to buy adult trees so that it looked like the property was established and had been there a very long time. He wanted to create something beautiful, and Ahmanson was very impressed. The first building, which is no longer there, which is now the site of the Ahmanson Center, was for the National American Fire Insurance Company, which was one of Ahmanson's companies. And the second building, which is there, is the building at 9245 Wilshire in Beverly Hills. It has been altered a good amount, but a number of the original elements, the gold tiles on the outside, this double height stained glass window inside, the sculptures by Renzo Fenci in the front, all reflect values that home savings wanted to hold on to in that first moment: family, leisure, and a sense of calm that investing in home savings would bring you. So the first location was such a success that Ahmanson continued to hire Millard Sheets to do this work. And Millard Sheets very quickly realized he needed a lot of help. He ended up quitting his job at Scripps College, but he took a number of the students he had had at Scripps, and they became the people who helped do this work. Susan Hertel was sort of his right-hand person throughout the project. She had been a student at Scripps. Nancy Colbath was another student. They both worked on mosaics and painting. Right around 1960, 1961, Dennis O'Connor came from England to Claremont, California, where his wife's family was from. And he had had a training in sculpture and in drawing, and he became the sort of master of making the mosaics even more lively, like we see on the home savings branch with all those masterful hands and bags and all that. That's really the work of Dennis O'Connor, taking the original designs, which Millard Sheets created, and translating them into mosaic in a way that is really amazing. The sculptures were always done by outside people who Sheets knew: John Edward Svensson, Renzo Fenci, Albert Stewart before his death, and the one in Hollywood is Paul Manship, which they just purchased from Delaware and brought to the site in that case. But the rest of the artwork, the murals, the mosaics, the tiling, the words, the lettering, all of that was designed inside the Sheets studio and the buildings themselves. And Sheets then handed off to other people in his studio. He had a team of architects working in the studio. He had these groups who worked in picking out the right colors, in making the designs come together. They worked with Wallace and Wiley to do the stained glass. They're based in Sierra Madre to this day. And altogether, this work brought about a sort of cathedral of finance. They brought about buildings that people were proud of, that they created local landmarks, and that were a place where people felt their money would be secure and that they could feel proud that they were connected to something that was speaking to their whole community. So as Ahmanson continued to be happy with these branches, he also had a way to expand Home Savings and Loan. Within 3 years, it was the largest savings and loan in the country because it was allowed to buy up other home savings and loan type businesses all through Los Angeles and Orange counties. And as it expanded, he realized he wanted to create new buildings and have Millard Sheets create these landmarks in the local communities. The original buildings they had been just whatever building the previous savings and loan had been occupying. But by around 1960, they started building new buildings. So the buildings in Arcadia, in Burbank, in Whittier, in Buena Park, in Lakewood, they were all designed by the Sheets studio within the course of a few years. And that's the period where Sheets and all the artists were working full-time on this project. They really didn't have time to work on anything else because there were so many demands from Home Savings and Loan and from the Ahmanson family to create these locations. While a lot of the early ones have this sense of family or relaxation, by the time they were building in Pasadena and Lakewood, and then definitely by Hollywood, they wanted to reflect something about the local community as well. And that becomes the pattern, starting with the Hollywood branch all the way forward. And there end up being almost 200 of these, and they're built until 1991. As they expand all through California, and then through Missouri and Florida and Ohio and Illinois, and one in New York City, they want to reflect something about the local community. They want to make sure that they become a local landmark. And so in a place like Pasadena, the history was well known. And of course, they picked the Rose Parade to put inside on a mural there. But other locations didn't, Lakewood wasn't necessarily, it was a brand new community when they were building, right? It was just a new suburb being built in that moment. And so there wasn't an obvious thing to choose in terms of the local history. So in Lakewood, they put on the original branch, which was then torn down, and then there was a tower, which has now been renovated as well. But on the original branch in Lakewood, there were sailboats and there were people in bathing suits trying to talk about the closeness to the ocean and the idea that that would be a place you could go to the beach from. In Hollywood, they obviously focus on the history of the entertainment industry. The site had been where NBC's radio studios were originally, and before that, where The Squaw Man, which was the first moving picture filmed in Hollywood, was filmed. And so they wanted to reflect that history. They wanted the site to be a memorial, and a commemoration of all the things that movies and television had accomplished. We now have an Oscars museum in the last few years, but there wasn't that. And so in many ways, the facade and the back of the Home Savings branch in Hollywood is trying to capture who was important in the history of Hollywood in that moment. And it went all the way back to people who were dead, and it included people who were still alive, like Julie Andrews and others. And there are these amazing lists in the archives of all the people they considered in the different categories: actors, directors, producers, and they're cross-outs, and they're checking spelling and doing all kinds of work to make sure that the many, many names that get listed alongside the images of people like Charlie Chaplin and others on the bank, that they're spelled correctly, and that everyone who should be recognized is being recognized. So the branch was going to be finished in June of 1968, and the plan was to have 3 big public events to welcome the branch into the Hollywood neighborhood and to get attention from all the various audiences that they wanted to pay attention to Home Savings and Loan and this beautiful building. There was a plan for a Hollywood VIP event that would focus on studio executives and construction firms and other people who might want to do investments or loans through the location. There was an event with a fashion show focused on costumes and women in the entertainment industry. And then there was a big final event that was going to be the real opening with Charlton Heston as the MC and Groucho Marx as one of the invited guests. Some of these events did happen, but unfortunately on June 4th, 1968, when Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles, they decided to postpone the June 6th event with Heston and Groucho Marx. And then Ahmanson had a trip scheduled to Europe right after that. And unfortunately, when Ahmanson was in Europe, he had a second heart attack that proved fatal when he was in Belgium. So by the time that his family had had a funeral and the bank had already started functioning, there wasn't really a large event held in the summer of 1968 around the opening of this branch because of all the events that had changed things so dramatically. So after Howard Ahmanson dies, he'd been the person who kept approving this, and he was really the person in charge of Home Savings and Loan. Because he dies suddenly, there's some doubt about what will happen with the Sheets Studio and with Home Savings and Loan in general. But Ahmanson's nephews, Bill and Bob Ahmanson, take over. They had been working in the Home Savings Administration, and along with other people who were veterans of the banking industry, they continue the work and they remain committed to Millard Sheets being part of the system. And I argue in my book that some of the most interesting banks actually come out right after that period, because Ahmanson had been so convinced that things were perfect that he didn't want to change anything, right? That he wanted to basically reproduce the same branch. And we see that the Beverly Hills branch and the Studio City branch, they're the same basic architectural design with some changes in the artwork. After Howard Ahmanson dies, some of the branches are a little bit different. The layout of the branch changes in Santa Monica and Anaheim, and then they change rather dramatically in San Jose and San Francisco and some of the other branches into the late 1960s, early 1970s. They're reflecting some questions from the local communities about what they want to see included, and they also are showing changes in terms of the architecture and the placement of the banks. Home Savings and Loan wanted to continue to be a community bank, even as it was the largest savings and loan in the country. And so in the late 70s and early 80s, you see it opening in places like Tujunga, in La Mesa, which is a small city next to San Diego. And so it wasn't always, there are some branches in big cities, but there are many of them that are in these smaller communities in Northridge in the 1990s. And in those communities, there really wasn't any effort to tell the local history. And so part of what's special about Home Savings is that they really became dedicated to going in and researching, talking to the public library and to the Chamber of Commerce and other folks about who's important from this exact community. How can we represent this community on its bank, and how can it be proud of this location? And so that's what I think is really important about these locations, is that they really try to have a sense of community identity, not just somewhere like Hollywood, where we have a sense of famous names that are known around the world, but also the names of like Monty, Montana in Northridge, and to show some of the Cal State Northridge buildings right on the mosaic, to tell a local history that local people would recognize, but that people outside might not understand. So Millard Sheets continued to work with Home Savings and Loan and with the Ahmansons, and they continued to build these branches. And as they began to expand more in California and then outside the state, Millard Sheets looked at the calendar and realized he was in his mid-70s, and that he really would like to go to Gualala, where he had bought some land up in Mendocino County. And so the artwork actually does continue in the 1980s and the 1990s, but it's mostly being done by Susan Hertel and Dennis O'Connor in the Millard Sheets style. Sometimes you can see their signatures on some of these later branches, because Sheets had really tried to retire and return to painting full-time in that period. Millard Sheets dies in 1989. And these works continue until about 1991. And some of the later ones are in Florida and in Illinois, but some of them are also in California. For example, Woodland Hills had one of the very last ones done. La Cañada also has a very late mosaic. That one's in a frame inside the branch, giving a sense of sort of how they were trying to find a way to do the home saving style, but do it cheaper and sometimes in a way that might allow the mosaic to be moved more easily if the branch was ever torn down. Though I live in New York right now, and I've written about Civil War St. Louis and Reconstruction in Canada, I grew up in San Diego. And so I think that these mosaics may have been some of the earliest visions of California history I had seen. I remember driving past the branch in La Mesa, going up to Grossmont Center as a child, and there were images of Franciscan friars and vaqueros and folks in the gold rush and some Victorian women, both there and in San Francisco. And so it was like a way to see history in the background, kind of always part of the story, not something that got talked about a lot, but sort of a way to say something to give us pride in the local community. Home savings remained the largest savings and loan in the country and in the world until the late 1990s, when Washington Mutual, based in Seattle, became larger. And the people running home savings decided to sell home savings to Washington Mutual. In that period, as far as I can tell, the preservation of the buildings was about the same, that they continued to be treated well, and they understood that it was something that was important to all these local communities. However, in the 2008 financial crisis, Washington Mutual became the largest bankruptcy in American history, and the federal government was trying to find someone to quickly buy these locations on the West Coast, and JP Morgan Chase stepped up, which wasn't necessarily going to be an issue, but very early on, Tony Sheets, Millard Sheets' son, and other people found that they were trying to put the Chase colors, just make everything white and blue, that they were painting over some of the murals and that they were covering up stained glass or mosaics. And so there was a real alarm for people who cared about Millard Sheets and who cared about mid-century modern architecture that these buildings might be destroyed. I didn't know anything about that at this point. I actually only knew there were a few that I had seen, the one in San Diego, the one in San Francisco, the one in Santa Monica, Studio City. I didn't know there were so many. I thought this might be a quick article I would write, and then I'd go back to writing about the 19th century. Instead, I spent a number of years learning about the hundreds of locations, the rich archives for Millard Sheets that exist in the Smithsonian's collection, the materials that the Huntington Library has acquired around Dennis O'Connor's work, and interviewing as many worked either for Millard Sheets or for Home Savings. People who had been secretaries, people who had been tile installers, people who had been high up in terms of vice presidents and making decisions, architects and others. And I really got a great sense of how important this project was, how unusual it was, and how it continues to speak to these local communities, that they really serve as local landmarks, and I want us to do everything we can to preserve them. Millard Sheets ended up working in so many different projects in mid-century modern Los Angeles. He worked for Scripps. He had studied at Chenard. He helped found Otis. And so there's so many places where Millard Sheets and the artists and architects who worked with him play a part in what makes mid-century modern Los Angeles. In fact, when Los Angeles did the Survey LA project to try to find all of its important historical buildings, there was a separate Millard Sheets category to help keep track of all the projects that Millard Sheets had a hand in. And I really think that even though these home savings locations are often thought of in terms of their local community, which is important, that their local communities can step forward and preserve them, I think we also need to think about them as a whole, right? That the branch in Compton compared to the branch in Redondo Beach, the branch in Burbank, put in the same sentence as the branch in Encino, you really get a sense of the range of these projects and the ways in which they could both have a recognizable form and say something about the local community that I think is really amazing.